Grant Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, once again we have the sight of National Party members supporting a bill through this House that makes significant change to the activities of the GCSB and to the activities of telecommunication providers and telecommunication users, and we get 1 minute long fatuous contributions like that from Jackie Dean. It is a disgrace, Mr. Speaker, to be in this House tonight and watch the National Party once again ride roughshod over democracy, just as they've done time and again over the last 5 years. This government's commitment to democracy is wafer thin, Mr. Speaker, and I want to speak now briefly about the question of the lack of a publicly available regulatory impact statement. And I want to read from the Treasury website what it says about regulatory impact statements. To help ensure that the regulatory process is open and transparent, regulatory impact statements are prepared to support the consideration of regulatory proposals. They are published at the time the relevant bill is introduced to Parliament or the regulation is gazetted, or at the time of ministerial release. We are standing here in this Parliament tonight without a publicly available regulatory impact statement on a piece of legislation that imposes significant additional regulatory burden on telecommunications matters. And in addition to that, as my colleague David Parker says, for the second piece of legislation in a row tonight, there is no Bill of Rights vet, no Section 7 report under the Bill of Rights for these two pieces of legislation. Pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker, that cut to the heart of New Zealanders' fundamental rights and freedoms, the rights to go about their business without the state intervening in it. And we've had the discussion already tonight, Mr. Speaker, that there will be occasions when we expect our intelligence agencies to undertake activity. We do need to defend our national security, but we do that in balance with the right to privacy, with the right to freedom of expression, with the right to freedom of organisation. We balance those things together, and tonight this government rams through two pieces of legislation without releasing a Bill of Rights vet, and in the case of this bill, without putting up a regulatory impact statement. Mr. Speaker, that is wrong. It is against the principles of this House. As a Member of Parliament, I expect to be able to read a regulatory impact statement and understand what government officials believe the impact of this legislation will be on those who are affected by it. And I am unable to do that tonight, and not one member of the National Party should be voting for this legislation tonight in the absence of that material. And Mr. Speaker, I'm quite confused about this, because what the explanatory note to the bill tells us is that the regulatory impact statement was completed on the 12th of March. Well, where is it, Minister? Where is it? She keeps her head down now because the government is not prepared to give New Zealanders proper information to debate this bill. This bill has been introduced today to this House, and we are debating its first reading tonight. This is a disgraceful display from a national government that is riding roughshod over democracy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we move to the substance of the bill, my colleague Claire Curran has outlined some of the concerns that are in the public arena. It is very important that we set the context of this. The context of this is at a time when public confidence in the GCSB is the lowest it has ever been. A survey told us that 40% of New Zealanders have no confidence in the GCSB, and yet here we have a piece of legislation pushed through under urgency for its first reading that will extend the powers of the GCSB significantly. And I repeat again for this House, Mr. Speaker, this is the time for a fundamental review of our intelligence agencies. Yes, there are new threats to New Zealand's security out there. Let's make sure we get in place the organisation and the legislation that will protect New Zealanders' security and protect New Zealanders' rights. How can we know that we are doing that without that proper fundamental review? And once again, Mr Speaker, this legislation has been put through Parliament in this way because the national government wants to sweep under the carpet the debacle that has taken place with the GCSB around the Kim.com affair and what has followed on from that. Mr Speaker, that is not the way to make legislation. That is not the way to take on an issue that is of such significance for New Zealanders. Mr Speaker, the big difference between this legislation and the 2004 legislation that it seeks to replace is the introduction of the concept of security. It's in the title of the bill, and the idea of national security. The absence of a proper definition of that, the absence of any shared understanding of what we're actually talking about is the fundamental problem I have in this first reading. And what we now see in this legislation is significantly increased powers for ministers. Ministers are deciding what national security means here. And in fact, not ministers, but one single minister, Mr Speaker. That is a massive extension of the power of what ministers can do. And members of Parliament will recall that one of the interesting moments in the .com saga was the ministerial certificate signed by Bill English in John Key's absence to suppress evidence in the court. Well, what this bill does is set up a whole process for being able to put evidence to a court that only the court will see and defendants will not see. And who will be making that decision but one single minister, Mr Speaker? So it massively extends the power of an individual minister. More than that, the Labour Party over the years has copped a lot from the National Party about so-called nanny state initiatives. Well, what's this, Mr Speaker? What's this, apart from going into private business and setting enormous burdens upon those businesses about what they are able to do and the things that they have to do? It talks about an escalating enforcement regime, Mr Speaker. So this is a piece of legislation. Again, we don't have a regulatory impact statement to get the officials' background on this, but it's a piece of legislation that on the face of it will increase costs significantly for people in the telecommunications industry. And for what, Mr Speaker? Because the government has simply not made the case for why this is necessary. And perhaps in the select committee process we'll start to get some greater idea from this government about what the case is that they're making here. But at this stage we have not seen that. All we have seen is a bill that increases the powers of ministers, that puts further burden on businesses, and we all know that it will be the users of those businesses that will wear the costs in the end, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this bill in its shoddy process that has come through to us, actually does do a number of things that I believe people in the telecommunications industry will be deeply concerned about. What it actually says is that the GCSB now has a role in the design and development of data and voice communication networks in New Zealand. It actually gives the GCSB a role in that, a vetting role, a role where they could actually stop the development of a network if they believe it somehow breaches this undefined national security. Have a think about that, Mr Speaker. That is a government agency having the ability to say to an NGO or to a private business, I'm sorry, your network's not acceptable to us. That's the kind of intervention that this bill is proposing. And that's right. What will that do in terms of people who want to invest in telecommunication networks in New Zealand? The government has simply not made the case. There are numerous unanswered questions within this piece of legislation, a piece of legislation introduced today under urgency. Mr Speaker, we need good, strong measures to protect New Zealand's national security. If we're going to get measures that are durable, that requires a cross-parliamentary understanding. We support having good, strong intelligence agencies, but what we cannot support is legislation that rides roughshod over democracy, that fails to make the case for why it is necessary, and that appears on the face of it to give the government extraordinary powers to intervene in the activities of private businesses. That's the kind of thing someone once told me the National Party was all about, supporting the rights of business people to go about what they do without unfair interference. Well, that's all gone, Mr Speaker, because tonight what we see is legislation from a National Party with no commitment to democracy, that's obsessed by its control and the control of individual ministers. Mr Speaker, this bill is being opposed by the Labor Party tonight. We have not seen a case made for it by the National Party, and the way they have gone about it, the process they have used, has been a shoddy process, and they are making a sham of our democracy.
I recognise the honourable member Stephen Browning. Tinakwe.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak to the Telecommunications